Welcome. If you are interested in music, this episode should be very interesting as we will be exploring the popular music of the 1100s. Yeah, way back then. Now, as now, musicians are often at the forefront of challenging traditional ideas and expressing new ideas musically. More detailed information is also available in our book, Things You Don't Know, Fun History Shorts. It's available through Amazon.
Dr. Weaver, what kind of things did you have in mind when talking about pop music in the 1100s? And why do you think it might be relevant or interesting in our 21st century world today?
In the 12th century, music was generally performed under the patronage of kings and the church. However, just as is true today, there were street musicians who performed without patronship, very much like the street musicians of today. You've seen them, a guy playing a guitar with his case open and people toss money into it. Well, that was kind of what happened with the Jongleurs. They made their money through money that was given by the people who were listening. Historically, music has played an important role in changing attitudes. For example, in the 1960s and 1970s, we had folk songs and war protest songs. In the 1100s, Europe had the Jongleurs, who were, at least in part, protesting a hierarchical society.
I must admit, before we looked at this topic, I had not heard of the Jongleurs, although I had heard of the troubadours. I imagine many people had not heard of the Jongleurs. Who exactly were they?
Yeah, heard that before. The Jongleurs were street musicians and musical rule breakers. They also included in their performances short plays, juggling, sleight of hand, all these sorts of things. Their name, the Jongleurs, actually comes from the French for jugglers, which, as I said, was often a part of their performance.
Now, where did they perform?
Well, they would perform in town squares and places like that. In many countries throughout Europe, they have these little squares in the towns where people often gather, like a little park, sort of like Central Park in New York, huh? Except they used it a lot more than and for different things than we do today. Anyhow, in their performances, they often included comic dialogue or fabliaux, the type the types of which varied by country and presumably by taste or interest. For example, in Germany, they tended to focus on scatology. In Italy, they focused on kissing. And in France, sexual intimacy. In Norman England, the jongleurs trended more towards a more eclectic modality, using some pieces from all of those different types.
Sort of reminds me of adult cartoons today, like South Park or Chaucer in the Middle Ages, with Canterbury Tales, particularly the Miller's Tale, Reeve's Tale, and the Summoner's Tale. A well known storyline is found in Gumbert and two clerks. Two traveling clerks, young students, take up lodging with a villain and share the bedroom with Gumbert, his beautiful wife, and their two children, one teenage girl and one baby. One of the clerks climbs into bed with the teenage daughter and, promising her his ring, has his way with her, while the other, while Gumbert has gone to the bathroom, moves the crib with the baby so Gumbert, on his return, lies down in the bed occupied by the clerks, one of whom is in bed with his daughter, while the other is now having sex with Gumbert's wife, who thinks it is Gumbert come to pleasure her. When the first clerk returns to his bed where he thinks his friend still is, he tells Gumbert all about his erotic adventure, bragging the way men sometimes do. I've just been having sex with our host's daughter. Humbert attacks the first clerk but ends up being beaten up by both. Now, this tale is very famous. It's found practically unchanged in Boccacio's Decameron and Geoffrey Chaucer's The Reeve's Tale. Another famous fableau is L'Enfant de Neige, the Snow Baby. This is a black comedy. In this tale, a merchant returns home after an absence of 2 years to find his wife with a newborn son. She explains one snowy day she swallowed a snowflake while thinking about her husband, which caused her to conceive. Although this was a lie, pretending to believe in the miracle, the couple raised the boy until he turns 15, and the merchant takes him on a business trip to Genoa. There he sells the boy into slavery. On his return, he explains to his wife that unfortunately the sun burns bright and hot in Italy, and since the boy was begotten by a snowflake, he just melted away in the heat.
Fabio are somewhat risque, often sexually obscene stories presented in a humorous manner that frequently expressed attitudes contrary to the church and nobility. The fabliaux spread into England in the 1300s and became very popular with working class people. I mean, they got off on making fun of king and church and all that sort of thing, much as we do today, although we don't have royalty. The music and the themes that the Jongleurs popularized slowly became included in the thinking of many people. Interestingly, the fabliaux form has been carried into modern literature. Yeah, for real. Like, for example, Roxanne, Sherlock, Game of Thrones, and Revenge are often cited as present-day fabliaux in Prezi.com as having, elements of fabliaux. It's also fair to say that present-day erotic literature, porn, if you will, can be traced to fabliaux.
I'm curious, did women participate in the Jongleurs musical presentations?
Well, okay, if you're wondering about the difference in the style of music, there were huge differences between what the Jongleurs did and the mainstream music of the day. Remember that the main repository of music was the church, and the church did not approve of either the topics covered, the performers, or the musical composition. Church music of the day was primarily chanting, sung in one key, without modulation, and without percussion instruments. The Jongleurs, to answer you more specifically, yeah, they had female performers. While in church-approved music, the only females who performed were nuns, and even then, female performance was constricted. They would have like the nuns stand there rigidly, not moving, and sing, and then they would sort of fade away after they sang. It was thought that having percussion, the boom chicka boom boom chicka boom, that having percussion or females perform would arouse sexual desires, and this might provoke people, especially men, to act out sexually. I gotta say, as a male, I object to the idea that males cannot control their sexual actions.
I do also. It's insulting. But the idea that it was not acceptable for females to perform has certainly been around for a long time. I know you've mentioned to me in the past that particularly in Italy, it was not unusual, I can hardly believe this, to castrate males before puberty to prevent the voice range changes that come with male puberty. So they would be able to sing forever in the soprano range and thus be able to continually perform as female actors.
Yeah, spot on. They called those unfortunate boys the castrata, and that practice continued for a long time, centuries. It did finally become outlawed, but it took some time to fade away.
I know in England, in Shakespeare's plays, prepubescent boys played female roles. I wonder if that had something to do with the kind of restrictions on music that you mentioned.
Yeah, I imagine it did. Church music forbade certain musical structures. For example, composers were not to have certain distances between notes, referred to as intervals. One such interval was called the devil's interval. Bum, bum, bum. It was thought that using that interval called the devil and put people at risk for the devil to appear and snatch the souls of those producing the interval.
Good heavens.
When you hear the interval, to the Western ear, it feels anxiety provoking or kind of unsettling, unfinished. You can hear this interval in the song Maria from the musical West Side Story. You hear it in the pitches between Marie, which is resolved in the last syllable. Ah, Bernstein, who composed West Side Story, used this interval in an ingenious manner throughout the musical, as have other composers. But the interval in West Side Story always presages conflict with two different outcomes. When the interval is resolved, in other words, moved to a more pleasant thing to your ear, even if some tragedy results, the singers also had some positive resolve. On the other hand, if the interval is not resolved, violence and mayhem resulted. Another interesting thing is that the interval became included in music in the what we call the dominant ninth chord. Bach did this with great effect, especially in some of his toccata and fugues. The dominant ninth chord became a staple in some forms of jazz and other popular music, such as heavy metal, rock, and that sort of thing.
Please take a listen to our two podcasts on Deals with the Devil, both in a supernatural and political sense, if you want an interesting topic. But getting back to music here, what were some of the differences in the performance between jongleurs, trouviers, and troubadours beyond the content?
Well, there were some pretty big differences, and we will get into several issues. One of the biggest things is that the jongleurs improvised a lot of the music they played, which means they did not write down their music, or if they did, it was not preserved by nobles or the church. They probably did what a lot of modern musicians do. They have a kind of a musical sketch or notes, but even these were not preserved.
What's intriguing to me is whether anyone did anyone begin as a jongleur and then graduate to more conventional performing? It seems like this would be a very effective training ground.
Yeah, you're right on target. There were several strata of musicians in the 1100s. The jongleurs, since they were the poorest, were considered the bottom rung. The troubadours, trouvières, and minstrels were considered higher in the ranks. Since the jongleurs had to be skilled in playing several instruments, they could and did rise in the hierarchy according to the needs of the other groups. This kind of movement is not uncommon today at all. For example, if a group today suddenly finds themselves needing a drummer, say the drummer gets sick or whatever, they may get another lesser known drummer to fill in, and that drummer may then become recognized as a skilled musician.
So over time, then mainstream music began to adopt the jongleurs' methodology.
Over time, perhaps. In classical music, there are periods we identify as belonging to certain styles with certain rules. In classical music, the first kind of recognized style was plain song and chants, followed by the Baroque period, which culminated in about 1759, the year of Bach's death. The classical period ending in about 1900 and then sort of smooched in there. It's not considered a real era, but impressionistic music came around 1900, 1910, and continued for until 1930, 1940. That Debussy is a prime example of them. Romantic era, which ended in 1950, 1960, maybe something like that, and the modern era, which is the period we're still in. There were some more overlaps between styles, of course. Common or pop music has also gone through many different permutations. Usually, these permutations happen more quickly, and that would include things like big band, doo wop, different forms of jazz. There's even today, there's a couple of different schools of jazz. There's like the Philadelphia jazz, there's the New Orleans jazz, Southern jazz, etc., and rock and roll, all of those sorts of things. But to answer your question specifically, the advent of jazz actually moved some of the Jongleurs' musical forms into more widespread acceptability, and also moved those changes moved into what we call classic music too.
This is wonderful. I'm learning along with the audience, Dr. Weaver. What do we know what the music sounded like?
Well, really, almost everything was different. Back then, musical instruments were tuned to one key. So music was written and performed in one key. Percussion was frowned on, so drums, along with other instruments, were rarely used. The way music was written down was also radically different. Back then, they used something called neumes.
I'm sorry, I have to ask, what the heck are news?
Well, okay, today, music is written down using notes on a staff, which is like 5 lines. Today, we specify the exact pitch and the duration of each note. In the 1100s, they used squares or triangles placed on a staff to indicate the approximate pitch, and the duration was indicated by how close the neumes were to one another. This only was functional because they were playing in just one key.
We're getting a graduate level course in music here, friends. This is wonderful. Okay, I'll bite. Just what is a key?
Well, key of a piece of music refers to the tonal center and dictates the scale and the pitches predominantly used in the work. An analogy, it's kind of like the sun in the middle of a solar system surrounded by planets. In this analogy, the sun is like the key, and the planets are like individual notes. To follow further on that solar system analogy, the orbits of the planets in relation to the sun are like the scales. In the time of the jongleurs, instruments were tuned to one scale and thus could only play in one key without being retuned, which limited the music significantly. In Western music, there are 12 different keys, each based on a different note of the chromatic scale. The most common keys are major and minor, which are defined by their specific patterns of whole and half steps. A piece in a major key generally covers a bright, happy, or triumphant mood, while a piece in a minor key can sound sad, melodic, or tense. The key is an important aspect of a piece of music as it affects the overall tonality, mood, and emotional impact of the composition. Today, most music modulates or changes from one key to another in the same piece. This allows greater expression. This is possible because we use what is called a tempered scale instrument. Modern pianos are tempered scale instruments. They can play in all the keys that we use in a master stroke. J.S. Bach proved this when he wrote the Well-Tempered Clavier. This is a 2-volume set which has music in all 12 keys. To get around this limitation, getting back to the Jongleurs had groups of instruments tuned to different keys. They were some of the first musicians to experiment with polyphony and polyrhythms. The Jongleurs were also responsible for introducing new musical instruments to Europe during the Middle Ages. They used things like lutes, harps, flutes, drums, tambourines, etc., to create their own unique style of music. The Jongleurs' contributions to music theory included developing scales and modes that are still used today in modern classic compositions. Their influence on European cultures is still evident today in many aspects of our lives.
I'm seeing it more and more. Earlier, you mentioned that music has had a great deal of social impact for centuries. When we did the podcast on Woodstock, please check that out, friends, if you haven't, and comment on it. It was obvious that the songs had an impact and perhaps foreshadowed events and public opinions that followed that event. But since you specifically mentioned music, I have to ask, did you really mean that music without words also impacts society?
Absolutely. I know it's a little bit of a different concept for most people. Music and the graphic arts have played a significant role in setting emotional tone and the way that human thoughts are formulated. Yes, it actually affects them. How? Well, it traces all the way back to ancient Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian temples, which often have columns which frequently vibrate and emit pitches which have been proven, scientifically demonstrated, to stimulate different areas of the brain and seem to foster a positive, relaxing, and meditative state. This may be related to the chanting of um. Music also affects people, often on a subconscious level. There are many examples, too numerous to get into now, but just to mention a couple of listening to a Gregorian chant. Well, that really does kind of give a person a meditative sort of mindset. Listening to Bach's fugues also causes physiologic changes, measurable. Listening to Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata elicits feelings of passion, while his simple piece Feu Elise seems to have a romanticizing effect, especially on females. Debussy's Fieve Chevaux de Lin conjures a young girl happily dancing through the field of flowers, and you can feel it, you can almost smell the flowers. Jimi Hendrix rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. If you haven't actually heard it, folks, you really should listen to it. Yeah, you should listen to the version that we have in Woodstock, but you should listen to what a studio recording and then listen to what he did at Woodstock. They're slightly different. The one at Woodstock is far more authentic. But anyhow, in that, you can hear the sounds of battle, gunshots, helicopters. He made all those sounds with his guitar, and it evokes visions of that war and puts you in that frame of mind. So yes, music by itself without words dramatically affects the human psyche.
I certainly see what you mean. I guess the same could be said about graphic art and the use of certain colors. I know you mentioned to me going to the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and how the art and color combinations there were very moving.
Oh, indeed, it was. And I would recommend that to any of our listeners who want to have an experience. People don't really realize that that museum has the world's largest collection of Salvador Dali. Anyhow, recently, there's been a movement away from considering the arts to be less important than the quote STEM curriculum. Look, I'm a scientist. I'm also a musician. I firmly believe that both are very important. important. And in combination together, they represent what it means to be human. Without science, the human race is probably doomed. Maybe anyhow. Without the arts, the human race will not stay human. We need both.
We absolutely do. There's a great book by the great scientist C.P. Snow called The Two Cultures that explains that in some detail. But combining art, science, and history is one of the things that makes doing these podcasts such a joy and so wonderful for me. Hopefully, our listeners have enjoyed this little excursion into a thread of history, and perhaps it will help you to connect things that happen into a stream of events that we call history. I want to make it very clear history is not just the dead past, it is past, present, and future. So the next time someone tells you they don't like the music you're listening to, just tell them you are listening to the possibilities of the future and think about all the benefits of where expanding your thoughts may lead you.
Again, Dr. Dean, as you often do, you just hit the nail on the head. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. We look forward to having you with us for more adventures. Please give us a like. Do it now while you're thinking about it. Subscribe. Leave comments. We really, really enjoy hearing from you. Does it guide us? No, not necessarily. Does it give us some ideas? You betcha bippy. Do we like to have them? Yippers, yippers. And, we really want to encourage you to do that. But anyhow, for now, I'm going to leave you, but you should come back because we have some really interesting things coming up. Of course, we have a series on Pride Month that we're going to continue. And we have numerous other things, too numerous to even describe right now. So bye for now.
See you soon, folks.